Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Thank you for joining us with this webinar today titled Uncovering Offshore Funds, Opportunities to Advance Human Rights. So I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things quickly before we jump into the action. First of all, welcoming our audience. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a great turnout today. Huge thanks to our panelists and organizers. We have translation today, which is extremely helpful in Spanish and English. Please go ahead and turn that on. For some of you, there's a more button with three dots. You can click on that and interpretation shows up there. You can choose English or Spanish. For others, it will show up as a globe icon. So please go ahead and do that. Throughout the entire presentation, please feel free to submit any questions in the chat box, and I'll be sure to pepper them in as I can. Also, please feel free to continue to add questions for the end during our question and answer period. But I think that's it for the housekeeping. I wanted to give us a brief intro to our discussion today, where we'll be talking about high-level panel discussion on wealth taxes and the measures that the Global South are taking to tackle billions of dollars that are hidden in offshore tax havens, and whether they can succeed amid a global food and energy crisis. So as we all know, the COVID-19 crisis and the worsening of inequality is expected to push 263 million people into extreme poverty in 2022 alone, reversing 2 decades of progress. The wealth of billionaires, meanwhile, has soared, with 573 more billionaires in the year by March 2022 from the start of the pandemic. Currently, 56 million people have financial assets over 1 million, holding 40% of the world's wealth, holding 46% of the world's wealth. Addressing the most pressing human rights issues during a pandemic clearly needs more resources. These range from providing COVID-19 vaccines to everyone and responding to the food and energy crisis, to investing in social protection for those most impacted by multiple crises. Some Global South countries are starting to take some steps. In Argentina, for example, a country that has greatly suffered from illicit financial flows over the past decades, there's been a proposed law for taxing the undeclared offshore wealth of Argentinians to pay off their debts to the IMF. To implementing this proposal, they are looking at the ways to identify different types of assets and offshores that are held offshore. Similarly, across the Latin America, beneficial ownership registries and wide asset registries are gaining ground. Also in Uganda, the government is introducing a new rule requiring firms which supply goods and services to the government to disclose the identities of the real owners of these companies. Such a registry would be a major step to improve ownership transparency in the country and reduce the cost of the government's responses to major health and food crises, and to improve social protections. Meanwhile, in Russia, the invasion of Ukraine has led to proposals for greater asset transparency, such as the proposed Global Asset Registry by ICRICT, TJN, and FTC, and others, which is key to tackling corruption. A European asset registry is also gaining more momentum as we find the real beneficial owners of yachts, properties, trusts, private equity investments, or companies owned by Russians and Russian people and entities sanctioned in multiple countries that can't be found. Clamping down on secretive tax havens is also key for countries to protect their citizens hit by multiple crises. This is not easy, considering that, as the Financial Secrecy Index recently launched by the Tax Justice Network revealed, that the US is actually the leading jurisdiction where assets tend to be hidden, including possibly assets belonging to Argentinian and Ugandan citizens. So today we seek to discuss whether measures being taken to recover hidden assets from Global South countries held in tax havens are successful. What else needs to be done to address this problem? And is the current focus on Russian oligarchs' hidden wealth having an impact on recovering wealth from the Global South and from Global South oligarchs? So to advance this conversation, we brought on a number of esteemed colleagues to serve as panelists. We have Professor Attiya Waris, who's an independent expert on external debt and other financial obligations and human rights. We have Mr. Djaffar Shalchi, who is the founder of Human Act Foundation with its initiative, Millionaires for Humanity. Also, Mr. Ricardo Martner, who's the commissioner of ICRICT. And finally, Itai Hagman, who is a member of the Chamber of Deputies in Argentina. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our colleague, Professor Waris, to kick us off with some perspectives from the independent expert on external debt perspective.
Thank you very much, Eryn. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to be on a panel with the lovely gentlemen. I'm looking forward to a good discussion. I'm the UN independent expert on foreign debt and other financial obligations and its implications for human rights. There are about 45 mandates, all housed at the Human Rights Council, that work on different issues and topics, from global solidarity and unilateral sanctions across to a working group on discrimination against women. So there's a huge variety, and all of these consistently working on any type of issue that touches on human rights and any implications to human rights. And why do I start from there? I start from there because although my mandate is foreign debt and international financial obligations, all the mandates regularly look at the implications of the absence of resources and the limitations that it has on the ability of a country to not only have improved living standards, or at least the maintenance of them, as well as alleviation of poverty development, while they are achieving not only human rights, but also the sustainable development goals. And from a perspective of how each mandate works, and this is where I think it becomes very interesting, the mandate allows me to do three specific things. I do country visits. For example, this year in August, I will be in Argentina, but I'm also mandated to produce thematic reports on different topics. And my October report, for which there was a call for contributions out, and they're still coming in, is actually on the creation of an international fiscal or tax authority, as well as the debates around a multilateral tax convention and where that should be housed. Now, all of these sometimes may sound very technical, but they have a direct impact on the amount of resources countries and regions have, not only to develop, but to react in crises and at a certain speed, depending on the type of situation a country is facing or a region. And the issues around COVID are a true example of how the absence of resources continues to limit the ability of states to get vaccines across to their peoples. So that is sort of where my mandate places itself. The third tool that I have is that I communicate directly with heads of institutions, states, and organizations across the world. An example is I recently, together with other mandate holders, we wrote a letter to the OECD questioning human rights abuses as far as access to information was concerned from a human rights perspective, as they continue to debate and discuss issues around digital taxation and the multilateral convention. Others include writing to the IMF on their gender strategy. So it's a very wide variety. Sometimes it's done individually as a single mandate holder, but very often we work in teams and across different areas and issues that are of shared concern across the world. And that is my mandate broadly. But I want to really talk about why human rights is so important and why it should be the center focus of any conversation we're having about resources. Ever since I took over the mandate, I use a tagline. My tagline is rights require resources. It's nice and catchy, but it really does mean that. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the right to vote in a country, or the ability to access fair trial, or even whether you can put food on the table. All of these are rights, and all of them cost money. So the problem becomes, what happens when a country or a people or society, a community or an individual doesn't have these financial resources? Well, they go through a series of situations, more and more desperate, until you reach a point where you cannot survive, and it does link to the right to life. But where is the implication at a global level, and what do we need to do about finances to make sure that these situations that are so dire don't happen? Well, in my perspective, and this is something I've looked at for over 15 years now, illicit financial flows and the inability or the unwillingness, not only of states, but of international organizations to grasp onto these resources, control them to a certain extent, and then tax them where they are taxable, means that that particular nation or region is unable to collect the resources that it has designed its system to collect. Now, if that country doesn't do that, the result is that they cannot then spend the money to improve living conditions in those countries. So countries have these beautiful national development plans, they have these tax targets that they put into place, then they resort to pulling out debt and taking on more debt to fill in the gap. Sometimes it is foreign debt, sometimes it is domestic debt. Sometimes it is a public creditor, sometimes it is a private creditor. And all of these have power implications as regards the ability of that state and those people to continue to operate where they are. And it is these power imbalances that result from the inability of a state to control its resources adequately that results in so many far-reaching consequences. Now, we have a lot of problems also, not only regarding illicit financial flows generally, but globally there are a lot of problems in trying to grapple with the way big companies are reducing the amount of available spending for public needs. And many countries across the world are privatizing public services. And this is a result of the inability of a state to run its social services. And so it's literally a vicious circle. If we don't stop it at certain points in time, it does get worse. And so then you result in debt servicing with high levels of interest. And then you have austerity policies. And very often it is the creditor that decides how a policy is developed in a country and how tax policies are designed and developed, where spending takes place. And so the more debt you take on as a country or a region, the more likely it is that the manner in which you will then collect money to pay off the debt is going to be outside the control of state or citizens' priorities. So this cycle starts to then begin to feed itself, and it does result in a downward spiral. And so it is so important. There are many tools out there. There are the guiding principles on debt and human rights that have been developed by previous mandate holders in my mandate. They are the guiding principles on human rights impact assessments. And there's been repeated global calls that when we are looking at debt or illicit financial flows or taxes, we need to put the human being at the center and the focus of this entire conversation. And that is why previous mandate holder actually asked for reform of the international debt architecture. But that then does bring me to the issue of a recent letter that was made public, which I'd like to mention before I close. Four of us, the Special Rapporteur on Poverty, the one on Development, International Order, and myself, sent letters to not only the OECD, but to the G20 presidency in Indonesia, the G77, the G24, and the EU, raising concerns around what is being called the two-pillar solution to address tax challenges from the digitization of the economy. And so far, we have only received a response from the OECD, and it's difficult to understand what information we are going to be able to use from that response to actually better understand the challenges facing least developing countries and developing countries. And the letter is available publicly on the UN website. And I think it's really important that institutions that have a hand to play in how countries are able to run their finances should come out very openly and cleanly about how they are making those decisions so that everyone is clear on the way forward. And I think that's where part of the human rights perspective becomes so important. It's about access to financial information, and it's access to information resulting in financial decisions. I will have 2 visits already planned, and I think it's worth mentioning because maybe people in the room would like to send responses to my call for contributions. In addition to Argentina in August this year, I will be in Liechtenstein in June next year. And unfortunately, my trip to Pakistan has been proposed, but I'm waiting for dates. But I think that if I was to leave you with one very important thing about this big conversation, and you gave very granular examples, Eryn, I think it is that the world is in a state of multiple crises. And although money is not the whole and soul of the solution, very, very often it can really alleviate a crisis. And so we really need to make sure that while we're having these multiple crises, that we are redirecting our finances to where we can alleviate the crisis as much as possible. Thank you very much. Back to you, Eryn.
Thank you. That's perfect. I think that a little bit later in the conversation, we'll get to the point that you made very directly about access to financial information being a critical piece to this discussion. And now we'll turn it over to Djaffar, who will speak to us about the perspective of millionaires, for example, and the role that they play in advancing a wealth tax from Davos and other moments, and then other perspectives from that point of view about why this wealth tax is seen as a solution, and the relationship between taxation and the provision of universal public services and the creation of opportunities for all. So Djaffar, please go ahead and take us away. You're still on mute. Still on mute. I think just at the bottom of your screen, I think on the left-hand side, there should be a little microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Closed it before. Hi, nice to be here, and nice to be with you all. I think I'm the only one that have a totally other background than the rest of the panels and the others, as I can see. I am among the 0.01% of the population who is a part of the problems that we have today in our world. I started more than 30 years ago in real estate developing construction work in Copenhagen, Denmark, and achieved a lot through the years. But when the UN closed the 17th Sustainable Development Goal 2015, where the president was a Danish minister, I clearly and fast saw that nobody actually talked about the financing of our sustainable development goals. And as you know, it's something about $3 trillion that is needed every year to achieve that. And they are combined, and I think is a beautiful way and a good way to start because they are so much connected, all of them, and you cannot actually take them apart, because we have the climate crisis, we have the inequality, the wars, and so on, and all the conflicts that we are talking about. So we have in any solution talk about the sustainable development goals, and there we have the big elephant in the room, the financing. So I just jumped inside it with all what I had, and started the Human Act Foundation in 2016, and saw immediately that a wealth tax was actually the solution to that. I talked to Jeffrey Sachs, who is working close at the UN, and with the General Secretary, with Thomas Piketty, and some of the other economics that has really been digging inside this to see how and what the solution, one of the biggest solutions are today. In the past was the VAT and other taxes, but today, if you're just going back and looking the last 2 decades, the total billionaires of the world was about 600 people, with a wealth about something between $3 or $4 trillion. And just 2 decades after, we can see now that we have 2,800 billionaires with a total combined wealth then more than $12 trillion is an astonishing amount of wealth that is out there. And if you are looking at the top 1% in the world, we know that according to Credit Suisse, we have about a total wealth in the world about $400 trillion. In the top 1% have more than 200 of it. So imagine that just a 1% or 2% wealth tax on the top 1%, that would actually be enough to give us all our financing for all our 17 sustainable development goals to go through. So we have the world, we have the money outside there. So the solution is, how are we going to select it? And I have been to many conferences the last 7 years, and we are talking all about the problems, and we should also talk about them. But I think that we need to talk more about the solutions. What are the solutions and how are we going to achieve them? So we started with our first program called Move Humanity with Jeffrey Sachs at the UN in 2018, and adopted that at the UN, that we want a UN resolution where the UN go out and actually recommend their member states, because all 193 countries had obligated and signed to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and also at the same time say that they want to get the financing for it. But no government, not even the Danish government, had yet come forward with the money. So we actually are looking in South America to find some of the member states. One of them are actually Argentina, to see if they can be one of the countries that can actually put forward the resolution. And we know that the most of the countries in the world don't have been raised. So I think it would be a huge yes if it was proposed. So that will be one of the good. And the other thing is that the last 7 years that have pushed for this wealth tax, you can be here. There's so much now noise out there. So we could actually get our message until we founded the Millionaires for Humanity and work with the other NGOs, because we found out that when millionaires like me and peers like myself are together and go out and speak, then the media and actually the general population listens. Because hear it from normal people, it don't get any sounds, but hear it from ourselves, we could hear actually that the UN system, and Antonio Guterres was mentioning us last year, that a group of millionaires now was out there actually and say, hey, we are a part of the solution, because you cannot solve any of the big problems if you don't take that financing that top 1% has in their hands. So we have to, any solution, be a part of it. And I think the best way is that we can get as big a group as possible to go around and push our governments, the UN systems and so on, to find out the ways like Argentina did and push for a wealth tax, like Norway have, and so on. So we are pushing for that, and in the connection with our Millionaires members in different countries, and let's see. And we have made about more than 20 surveys in 20 countries. In Indonesia, there was actually more than 70% yes for a wealth tax. We put out a say who say yes for a wealth tax for everybody that has more than $10 million. And we have no country actually in the 20 countries that was below the 50%. So all of them was from 55 up to 72% yes. And the no was about 15%. And the rest was about, we don't know yet. So there's huge minority in the common general population for a wealth tax. But as we know, as I know myself, that unfortunately is not just the financing that top 1% has. We are influencing our politicians enormously by lobbying our politicians also in Scandinavia. And we know how it is in the US, that behind every senator is a big money man. So I think we just have to make a lot of noise, awareness, and a lot of action and partnership to get out there and collect and vote for the young politicians that have the courage to go out and really vote for a wealth tax. But of course, if a big country like the US with Senator Bernie Sanders, also Warren can come forward and get a small wealth tax through the US, then I think it would have an enormous effect, and the Europe will follow after it. But there's a lot of talk about it. 7 years ago, everybody was laughing at it, but today with Argentina and one of the first to come and put a wealth tax on because of the crisis that we had, I'm very optimistic that in the future we will see more countries follow that, and that's actually what we are doing. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Djaffar. I think that it's super helpful to situate this conversation in real dollar amounts. So I appreciate you taking the time to go through, cost versus where the wealth is and how much it actually is. And I think that we all kind of had an imagination that it was that staggering, but to hear it in those plain terms is extra impactful. And I think you're right in terms of, advocacy 101, which many of us on this call are extremely used to. It's going to take action from multi-stakeholder initiatives, including the business community, which is incredibly important. So we appreciate and support and encourage any other steps that you all can take to help carry the message. You mentioned the US, and if it weren't for big banks and other big companies getting on board on beneficial ownership disclosure, we would have been sort of dead in the water in the conversation and taking it forward. So you mentioned how Argentina has successfully implemented a one-off wealth tax on the super rich to fund the COVID-19 response and other proposals that are going on there. Argentina is also facing debts from the IMF and looking to find ways to pay that off. So I wanted to turn over to Attai to give us some further information on what the initiatives look like in Argentina and what those solutions that we've all been dancing around really look like in practice, and what that looks like for you all in one country, and what those lessons may be for others looking to take these initiatives forward.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, voy a hablar en español.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in Spanish, and it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share with everyone on the panel. I'll talk about our experience tied to an issue that, of course, affects everyone. It was particularly harsh recently. It has to do with these financial exit of financial flows, which has to do with my two predecessors talked about, the issue of debt and the issue of excessive concentration of wealth. So in our country in particular, Argentina is seeing this in recent years. There have been intense capital drain in many cases towards tax havens, and this doesn't allow our economy to invest these resources in sustaining our economic development, our own economic development. I'd like to share a PowerPoint, if I may. May I?
Yes, please.
Ahí está. Bien. Les quiero mostrar algunos datos respecto a
Very well. I would like to show you some data from Argentina. The process of capital outflowing the country, and between 2006 and 2019 is the report. It has been a process of outflow of capital, of funds accrued of about the total GDP of our economy for a year. That is the total of capital outside of the country, almost close to the GDP of 1 year's worth. And so this puts Argentina in a much more acute situation than others in the region. And in Argentina, this process has been funded in part with foreign debt that has been intense. In the chart to the left, you can see the process with the green line that it's above. That is a foreign debt in millions of dollars that Argentina went into in 2016 to 2019, and the gray is the outflow of capitals. So you see that this is correlated. It is almost perfectly correlated on foreign debt and the outflow of capital. Foreign debt has been the main source of funding because of these outflows of capital. And on the other chart, this has been the process with dramatic consequences in Argentina, which was great investment on financial instruments that Argentina offered between 2016 and 2017. And this meant a runoff of exchange that was quite intense in 2018. This foreign debt and the outflow of capitals took Argentina to agreeing to an IMF agreement, the greater IMF deal in the history, because originally it was going to be $50 billion between May and June of 2018. Then it was expanded into $57 billion. And finally, the disbursement was $44 billion. And when there was a change in government, the standby program was suspended with the IMF, and therefore the whole amount was never disbursed. But according to the IMF, this agreement with the IMF had 5 disbursements, as you can see on the chart, and the situation from when the agreement started in May or June of 2018 until December of 2019, it is that Argentina received $44.5 billion, and in that same period, Argentina lost over 15 billion of international reserves. That is, the amount of outflows of capitals that Argentina suffered was in complete excess of the total amount of the disbursed financing of the IMF. Filling in the gap of the outflows of capital with foreign debt was not able to fully cover, and this took Argentina to a huge crisis that we're going through still, and we're about to exit in these years to come. And it is in that context where our country is discussing an initiative that I would like to discuss with you briefly in trying to recover part of these funds that went abroad by very few people and companies. This is a part of the magnitude of the concentration of the outflow of capitals. A few weeks ago, 10% of the people who took out these dollars, it is almost 54% of all the capital that went abroad. And in the case of the companies, 10% of the companies that took the wealth out of Argentina, it is almost 93% of the outflow. 1% of the companies is 74% of the outflows. So capital concentrated in a small group of people and companies. So what I was saying, the project in Argentina, it is of great importance because when we saw the Pandora Papers, it is saying that it's the 3rd country in the world in amount of beneficiaries of that scandal, following Russia and the United Kingdom. So it is a country that is seriously embedded in the flight of capitals and the use of mechanisms for fiscal evasion. So we are discussing a bill of law that right now it is with the representatives before going to the Senate, and what it's looking is to pay the debt with the IMF, capturing or repatriating part of the funds, part of this wealth that was taken out of the Argentinian economy. So basically what we're going to do is to demand a special contribution from all the assets that are offshore, that are abroad, and that have not been declared with the fiscal authorities. It means that all of the companies and people that have their assets abroad and are not paying taxes need to set up a fund to be able to pay the debt with the IMF. And this encompasses having currency, real estate, and other types of assets. We are considering a contribution of 20 to 50% of the assets. And I repeat, these are the assets that are outside of the country and without having been filed with the tax authorities. And then they're going to be paid in dollars because this is the currency that is going to be used to be able to pay off the debt with the IMF. And for that, the fiscal authorities from Argentina is going to have to formalize agreements with other countries, especially with the United States, because we estimate that a very important portion of these capitals that went out outside of Argentina are allocated in regions of that country. And we need to have cooperation with justice institutions, banks, stockbrokers to be able to find where the money is. And for that, we have created the figure of the collaborator. And this is something new. And this is going to be giving a monetary retribution for those people that can tip on the destination and the beneficial owners of the assets that have not been filed with the fiscal authorities and that are abroad. And this is an incentive system for repatriation of the capital. And the project, what it's looking for, to put at the center of the discussion, the issue of the flight of capital, the issue of fiscal evasion, and how the deal was made with the IMF. And this is something with unprecedented capacities. And this is a discussion to be held with Argentina and the IMF. These are problems that require a solution that cannot be limited only to a discussion of restructuring the debt. In Argentina, we come from a renegotiation with the IMF that was conducted in March of this year. There was an agreement to be able to expand for a 10-year term, things and more. Restructuring and the programs that have been put in place are things that are needed, but it's not enough to solve the problem. And what we're saying is we need to resolve the problem of the debt, the flight of capital, without having this as a burden on the workers and the different sectors that are part of the economy, that the sectors that are being benefited with the foreign indebtedness, where the burden is going to fall on, that brought so many problems to the Argentinian economy. It is a problem of justice and democratic reparation. In the same way, during the pandemic, there was a contribution required to be able to fund the necessary policies, to be able to aid the companies and the people to go through the pandemic, through COVID-19, with an extraordinary contribution of the greater taxpayers. This is something that is being discussed at the parliamentarian level in Argentina. And we hope that if this is passed and is going to be enforced, it's going to be an innovative measure as one of the ways to be able to look for repatriation of the funds that flew out of the country the wealth that has been evaded in the country, that are using tax havens as their safeguard, and to be able to pay a debt that has caused so much damage to our country. But this time, different from other times in history, this time is not going to be the people with their effort and sacrifice are going to be the ones who are going to be facing the consequences of paying off the debt. Well, thank you very much. And I leave it at this to be able to hear the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear the various initiatives and thinking about unintended consequences and how to manage a solution that actually gets to the heart of what you're trying to achieve here. One question is, has this cooperation with the U.S. already begun, or is it underway? At what stage is that cooperation?
Right. We are still at the point of sanctioning the law. It's under discussion in the Argentinian Senate. Now we've got it in the Chamber of Deputies, and once it's been approved and the law is being applied, then we can enter into agreements. Anyway, during the debate in the Argentinian Congress, we had participation by experts from the United States who talked about how to set up those linkages, those agreements with Department of Justice and other in the financial system in the United States. So I understand that the issue in the United States, they're concerned about it, they're debating this, and that is why we think that it might be possible to find in the United States individuals, institutions that are interested in collaborating with Argentina to come up with these funds that are to a great extent housed in different institutions in that country. So the agreement comes after the law has been approved. So that means in the course of this month.
Great. Wow, that's awesome. So I think the world will be watching to see how things unfold and to learn lessons from how agreements like this go forward and how maybe others can take notes and create similar collaboration. So thank you so much, Attiya, for breaking that down for us. We can turn to Ricardo, who's the commissioner at the Independent Commission for the Reform on International Corporate Taxation, otherwise known as ICRICT. And he'll be discussing the role and relevant commitments on key areas of financial transparency and tax reform to tax multinational corporations. And then also take us through a bit on major thought leaders on the global asset registries and some other points on the registry and how that potential solution set fits into the bigger picture. Ricardo?
Hola, Erina. Voy a hablar en español también.
Hello, I'm going to speak in Spanish as well, and I'll try to speak slowly. Thank you for the interpreters for your effort, and to the organizers for inviting me and making it possible to have this conversation in 2 languages. Well, you mentioned the ICRICT, a global worldwide organization with 12 commissioners around the world, economists, each of them, and have come forward as rebels, really, against the use and abuse of tax evasion with different mechanisms, particularly by transnational organizations. And so they're continuing with the conversations with the OECD, and the inclusive framework is what we've tried to propose are measures that can be really useful to eliminate the tax havens. I like to call them hideouts, because that's what they really are. That's where they hide things. They're not. So in that sense, we have been supporting the minimum rate, 25% as a minimum rate for corporations. And we also come out for the network of taxation, particularly digital taxation, so that each country can have its own taxation in terms of what these multinational corporations actually sell and what they actually do in the countries where they are. So there is a lot of important work to be done to follow up on this and to propose measures and make recommendations to improve international taxation, which really needs to be overhauled. The next big issue today, which has again come to light and which we've been working on for several years, is the whole issue of the global assets registry, excuse me, which in Spanish is the Registro Global de Activos. The global assets registry is the situation that we're living in the world now has brought all these issues up again, particularly because of the Russian oligarchs, but it's really a global problem. The problem of hidden wealth is supposedly something like $10 trillion, and therefore that's 10% of the world GDP, the GDP around the world. And out of this, 27%, according to some data, correspond to Latin America. So it's an issue. Well, a fourth of the hidden wealth is hidden by our co-citizens, those who are interested in evading and hiding their money, their own money. This is the money, most of it, in tax hideouts, hidden. So the whole issue of tax evasion is not a domestic issue. I mean, the whole issue is global. So we need to improve administration at the local level, and we can talk about that. But we also have to move forward on an asset registry that includes assets all over the world, to have an idea of what is the actual wealth of the multimillionaires, because we need to point out that during the last 2 years of the pandemic, multimillionaires have increased their wealth. So not really a contribution to improving the situation in the world. Instead, they've taken advantage of the recession and poverty that's affected most of the population. And so some are in extreme poverty and others have actually increased their wealth. So the question today is what to do about tax havens and the issue of records. We, as ICRICT, acknowledged that there has been progress in terms of revealing who the final beneficiaries, and then the whole issue of digital information. But if there's no political will, then it becomes very complex, because there is something that's fundamental that needs to be pointed out, that the Financial Transparency Index that just came out
Tax Justice Network indica que la mayoría
says that most of these countries that are not transparent are the developed countries. And not only that, the least transparent are the most developed countries in the global economy, including the United States. The United States might be the first, I don't remember very well, but they're going neck to neck with Switzerland. So that's an issue that is obviously fundamental from our point of view, the non-governmental organizations, which is to drive forward towards a system that involves greater transparency, of course, and this should lead to a greater capacity for taxation on global wealth. So, well, the whole issue of Russian oligarchs has also driven a new movement, a new voice to do the same with our own oligarchs, which is to try to understand where their money actually is. So as I was saying, this is a matter that's being dealt with in high politics. It's not going to be easy to handle, but it also should begin at home. I think that's where the link is between the national and the global. And most interesting, one of the most interesting and special matters of our times, because we have the capacity. We have the capacity to generate a greater ability to keep records of what the great evaders are actually doing. And so this is part of what the governments need to do. And we need to evaluate in what is wealth, what is a country's wealth, and what is it. So we have property records, and you evaluate the half of the market value of a property. So that's another issue where we can have adjustments in political economy in each of the countries. What is interesting is to see that new governments, new Congresses have been talking about wealth taxation as a new part of the new policy. It's not just about increasing the VAT, but to generate tax reforms that aim to have a better redistribution of wealth. How can we do this? Well, I think that there's an interesting to hear some multimillionaires who actually agree with this. I don't think you're the majority, but it's wonderful to hear the fact that there are expressions of or declaring capital. For instance, in Colombia, there's a tax on the wealth for almost 100 years now, and which has enabled them to improve their taxation. So that all this is an information flow that the corresponding institutions have in that country. So they don't only collect, I mean, sometimes they don't collect very much, which is another issue. It has to do with pressure, but it does involve an improvement of following up on what we have is a convergence to generate at least information, which is something that should be public, should be transparent. Don't you agree? And that in some way, it involves having tools so that in the future, our systems, tax systems can be more fair. In the 90s in Latin America, there was the famous Washington Consensus, which drove policy in Latin America. Basically, what it involved was collection, having the capacity to collect taxes. And how is this done? Through improving indirect tax systems, which was the easiest way, which is the VAT in particular. So now we have an excellent VAT system in most of our Latin American countries and a very lousy follow-up system for other taxes. Not only, so the challenge in the next years is to have a balance in these pillars of collecting taxes and generate taxes, more than taxes, capacity to tax, which is not the same thing, tax those people who are what we call the super rich. And that's the challenge. And I always say, this is what we need is a national basis, and this can expand towards a global registry. If we're not coordinated throughout our planet, then we are going to lose a lot of dollars or euros or any kind of money, because international coordination is going to be a big part of the solution to tax evasion and the elimination, we hope, of the tax havens, which we need to define what they are, what tax havens are very well, because there are countries who are about to become this. There are some jurisdictions with very low rates of taxing corporations, and this happens because this whole agreement that reaches 15% of the minimum rate. This doesn't really help to recover a fair and just global system. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. So just to say that the question and answer chat box is open. Please, participants, audience, submit any questions that you have for our panelists, either there or in the chat to the webinar. But thank you, Ricardo. I think that, we started off learning that rights require resources, and then we found out we do have resources. We just need to reach them. And that, there are some creative solutions being discussed in various countries like Argentina, which we used here as a use case. And then Ricardo so rightly pointed out, as did Attiya in the beginning of her conversation, was that the access to financial information is critical to these solutions, as is political will. And so I think in terms of political will, not only, the money being available, but also those willing to come forward and take ownership of their role in the global economy and to advancing rights and in a respectful way and in a way that appreciates more needs than just oneself is important. And so we've talked about a global asset registry as a point for access to information, access to digital information, and beneficial ownership registries as potential ways to do that. And that really accessing these assets that are held offshore is a national problem, but reaches to a global issue in the need for greater collaboration and corroboration to not only identify them, but then also to bring them back to the home country and then use them for the purpose that we hope that they all will be used for, in terms of advancing rights and supporting various initiatives to repay loans in a way that is helpful to communities and those most vulnerable and in need. And so I see a couple of questions coming in. So again, thank you to the panelists. I think that was a really robust and rounded out discussion that complemented various points within the discussion. So one question from the audience is that there's a tension between the underlying principles of tax justice and human rights, and that while representation raises questions about policy transparency and who can influence decision makers, but when it comes to the regression of human rights, this is seen through a national or domestic lens. The state protects or degrades respect for rights, but international processes are hidden from the domestic and national context and how those effects are presented in debates in domestic or national policies. So I think that's a roundabout way of saying, how do we in policy discussions, maybe Ricardo or Attiya, you can speak to this. How do we sort of ground these conversations that are happening either at the global level or at the national level in various cooperation points so that both sides are hearing key points and that the political will is ideally shifting?
Difficult question. No, I don't know, but what we can see, perdón, en español, lo que podemos ver es que tenemos.
What we can see is that we have some sort of momentum into more retributive policies. Is there consensus or dispute, polarized and extreme solutions throughout the region from the political point of view? And that makes it that at the end of the day, you can make progress, but with difficulties. One of the difficulties that I think, these are the arguments and the battle of the ideas. Oftentimes you say that the ability that we have to growth is going to be dependent upon investment, and that is logic, and to provide certainty to the investors. And tax rates are an important element to attract investment or not, because we continue to depend from foreign investment. So therefore, the tools of tax rates is going to be key to keep it low, to be able to generate the incentives. And that way of thought, it is quite risky in a world where they're trying to apply a 15% minimum, and in our countries we have about 30% on earnings. So it would be a way of going backwards to be able to have fiscal competencies. That is what it's been called, tax competencies. And this is something that we need to address globally, because there's no coordination, only competition. And in Latin America especially, because we don't have any institution that is generating the ability for coordination among the different rates, because let's remember that taxes have been and are a sovereign decision of each of the countries. So we need to turn that argument around and to say, no, taxes are also public investment. And if there's better public investment, there's going to be better health, better education, and this is going to provide greater certainty for international private investors. So let's look at it that way.
May I jump in, Eryn, as well?
Please.
Thanks. So there is absolutely a tension between tax justice and human rights. And I'll start with, from a legal perspective, the principle on international taxation is that there is no cross-border enforcement of tax liability. And then stop there. Like, that is the principle on how we take forward how to collect taxes from someone or an entity that is in another geographical jurisdiction. Now, the moment you say that, they're already outside your control, and we've just opened the door to this huge series of double taxation agreements, of tax havens. I mean, that's what opens the door for it. So that's the first part that is going to constantly give us a problem. As long as we hold on to that principle, it is going to hold us back. The second problem is that there are two approaches on how you look at principles of taxation. One is the more well-known Adam Smith Keynesian approach, which basically allows a country to compromise things like justice for buoyancy or equity. So they're seen as separate pillars in a tax system. But the other part of it is actually a much older, but I think a more robust system, which was the one developed by Ibn Khaldun, who is a North African economist, who talks about an underpinning of justice under all principles guiding taxation. Now, if you use justice as your basket or umbrella, and then you create your tax system in it, that does end up being a much fairer system. So yes, there is this tension, and it's a tension in almost every country in the world. And if you take that and you now make the link to human rights, then the system that follows the more the model that Adam Smith and Keynes looked towards are going to always compromise justice. And that is really where human rights gets knocked out, because a lot of the principles under human rights are about justice and equity and making life better for the most vulnerable in society. And that isn't a guiding principle, which Smith uses in his design of tax systems. So yes, there is this tension. But I want to remind you, 15 years ago, there wasn't much of a conversation on linking tax to human rights. So we've come an incredible way. And the fact that we're having these conversations are so important. But now when you look at human rights, Ide is asking also about state protection and the invisibility of it at domestic level. And this is, I think, where there was this split between economic, social, and cultural rights on the one hand, and then civil and political rights on the other. And the solution to that debate in the conventions was that they said that civil and political rights were immediately realizable, but didn't see it as something that you had to put money onto. Because if you say something is immediately realizable, it means we should do it at the click of our fingers, which is really not the reality. And so economic, social, and cultural rights were put aside because they said that's going to cost money. And then that's why I keep saying rights require resources. And I use both types of rights, whether it's a civil and political right or an example in economic, social, and cultural rights. Both of them do need to come together because they all cost us money. And that really is where I think that is really where the meat of the matter is. But I'm loving the question, Ide, and I think it could be a much longer conversation like that.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to continuing it. One thing that I think sort of flows out of those points you made is I think we've answered the question that we should be calling out or bringing to the forefront conversations about opposition to these obligations. And I'm interested to hear your plans, Attiya, and also Djaffar, in addressing, for example, the OECD's lack of full disclosure to your letter, and also, Djaffar, you did speak of a few initiatives and plans that you have for the future in joining the Millionaires and other wealthy individuals you work with in various UN-led or whichever initiatives. So I think the key question is, we're making the case that rights require resources, and we're connecting solutions to that. But at the same time, we all understand the need to counter those who are sort of stifling those talking points and stifling the basis of a justification for our work. So I'd be interested to hear what are some of the actions being taken to address those who are against these obligations and these steps forward.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, we are talking to our peers and millionaires and billionaires to tell them that it is first in their interest actually to come forward, because we are on the way to an incredible unsafe world. When the top 1% have more than the rest of the world, that's showing us that in each country, in each villages, today you cannot hide what we are doing. So we have to come forward, protecting ourselves, our own children, our own grandchildren. And secondly, we have to remember that is nothing as called like a self-made man. Each millionaires and billionaires, and like myself, have benefited from the generations of people who have lived in the countries where we have benefited our wealth through good healthcare, through good road systems and security and so on, built of generations on the shoulders of the people who have lived in their countries. So of course we are obligated to give back in our lifetime. That is the moral and the ethics of all this. And it has to be a democracy way. That's why it has to be a tax and not philanthropy. Because philanthropy totally in the world we know is about 24 billion, is nothing compared with what we are going to need, because we need the trillions of dollars. And secondly, we are talking a lot about the hidden wealth, and many is talking about the Cayman Islands, the Panama Papers, and so on. And sometimes I laugh a little bit, because to give you an example, the biggest hiding country is actually the US. If you just take a state like Delaware, Delaware is 10 times bigger than the Panama. So it's just showing us, if we are going to put this to life, we have, of course, to go after the big countries like the US, Switzerland, and so on, because they are there where the money is. But again, to compare that and see it from above, we have to remember, like Ricardo just said, the hidden money is about 5 trillion, something like that. But compared again to the 200 trillion that is in the top 1%'s hands, we're talking about, come on, 2% of the total wealth. So the resources are so enormously big that it's impossible for us to hide it. So even if you're not addressing the 5 trillions, that doesn't matter actually. Let's say it's 10 trillion that we are hiding. So we still have the 190 trillion. So it is so big. So still we have to introduce the tax, and the time is right now and we cannot come out of that. And that's why we are pushing and pushing to get to be more members and more organizations like us who are gathering the millionaires and billionaires together. And that's why we are making those letters to Davos, to the UN system, and so on. And one of our letters get actually more than 200 millionaires to sign it. And we actually had more than three actually billionaires, one from Africa, one from the US, and one from Europe to sign the letters also. So again, like Ricardo said, we are in the low numbers. I know that. We know historically that about 5% of the millionaires, billionaires is a good idea, but unfortunately, we still have to go after 95%. They're still not coming forward. So it is enormous hard work, and but I think that we all have to push in the right direction because all our problems are globally, and I know that more and more high level and ultra elite people know that there's no place to hide. There's no planet B. We have only this planet, and we cannot escape it. Maybe in 200 years, but not now. So what is our plan? Nothing, and we have to save it, and we have to do it fast now. We are 7 years inside the SDGs. And we have not achieved any financing for it yet. And we have only 8 years left. So I think it's time that we are awakening a little bit and maybe looking at the time also, because time is running out and it's going very fast.
Thank you. I think that the distinction between philanthropy and taxation that you just made is really striking, and again helps to put the conversation into context. From your perspective, Attiya, what's the next steps with the letter to the OECD and the response? Will there be follow-up, or how can we help? What's the plan?
Yeah, we are in constant talking with the UN and the other part of the UN system, and also some governments. So that is an ongoing work that we have done the last 7 years, and we're just pushing for that. And at the moment, we are pushing for a UN solution. So we are actually looking for some countries that can come forward and help us to say, yes, we need actually only 2 or 3 countries that can go together and make that proposal so we can have a UN solution. We are going after a UN solution like that we have at the ODA more than 20 years ago, that the UN go out and recommend as at that time 0.7% for all the member states to give to the poor countries. So it's something like that, go out and put 1% on their wealthy people, and that will actually give us many billions on the bottom. So a soft UN solution, I think, is needed now. And we're looking for some countries to come forward and be willing to put that proposal on. So if anybody can help in any way in that direction, will be enormously helpful for us.
Great. So we definitely hear that call to action. Attiya, what are your thoughts?
So thank you. I think it is so wonderful to be in a space where people are thinking very seriously about their own wealth. And I might, to be honest, very happy to be on the panel with you. So the letter that we sent to the OECD has received a response, and that has been logged online already. I would have hoped that additional countries would have taken the request seriously and responded. And I hope that they still will, because after all, it's an open letter. They can still respond and tell us about how they think they can start bringing information more to light. But I think that for now, I need to also focus on my report that will come out in October. And one of the things that I was looking to see was whether there would be a change, or at least a softening of some kind at the OECD, so that we could get information, not only so that I could understand things better, but hopefully so that the letter would help get more information out to concerned civil society, academics, and states who have a lot of questions about how these percentages were developed and the formulas being used. And unfortunately, there still isn't too much clarity on it. So we're going to allow them more time while we figure out how we're going to engage with it at the UN level. But I would like to encourage civil society, as well as everybody who cares, to use the letter. And I think for me, it's a great tool. If you want to measure political will, that letter allows you to measure political will because they answered the letter. So I'm grateful they also answered, because it does mean they took the request of the 4 mandate holders very seriously. And now we are hoping that they will now reflect on it, even if they haven't quite responded to our questions. Eryn.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, several calls to action coming out of the conversation, and I think that this is a ripe audience to hear those. And last but not least, Ricardo, just wanted to, bring us home in terms of, we just heard that time is running out and that these crises aren't certainly not going away anytime soon, and who knows what next will come. But I think that one important question is, we've just discussed the global asset registry as a tool for governments to move out of austerity. How long can we expect that these reforms will need to take to be implemented and to move forward? What's our reasonable time frame?
Okay, let's see. En español.
In Spanish. There are two aspects. One has to do with the whole thing of transparency at the global level. As was mentioned, these are powerful countries that are not doing very well. In the second, we have examples. The European Union is now organizing a registry, a European asset registry, and also talking about a task force to investigate and be able to generate capacity to follow up and to oversight both illicit financial flows, money laundering, and of course, evasion. So this actually is going to require a lot of work, a lot of data, a lot of people working, people with capacity, so that it can be done at the global level, of course. This is something that has to be at the level of the UN. We've always insisted that the UN has to be the main promoter of this force that we all need to create to have tax cooperation and not tax war. We also sent a letter to the G20 to try to promote, to get those countries that are in this in this endeavor to promote the GAR. It's probably not going to be something in the short term, but its implementation could take a while. But the idea needs to be accepted more, and that's interesting because our NGOs, our organizations have driven this debate on wealth and on the global asset registry. So I think we're on the right track, and we're still fighting in the right way. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Listen, everyone, we're right at time. I think that we've just sort of tipped the iceberg of really interesting and important conversations. We've talked a lot about cooperation and collaboration in order to generate that political will, the evidence base, and to generate those conversations in a even more meaningful way at the UN, at the national level, and bilateral levels to figure out how to direct the resources we need to fund and advance those rights that we've discussed. I think that the talking points and arguments are becoming stronger and stronger through, of course, thanks to our panelists and to those in the audience who have continued to support these efforts and have taken them forward in their home countries and at the international level. I think some important things to continue watching out for is the advancement in Argentina for its ways of advancing the wealth tax and cooperation with other countries, and how other countries can take lessons learned from those initiatives, how we can strengthen the arguments for connecting those dots, bringing on unlikely stakeholders, unlikely bedfellows, some may say, to helping us to make those arguments and to reaching those decision makers that need to hear it the most. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to the organizers and translators. I think this was a very successful conversation, and we look forward to continuing it and to